Uh, Good to
I
see you
know. Thank
again.
you. It's a pleasure.
Okay. Good to
I
see you
know.
again.
Thank you.
Okay, so we are now live. Um, Welcome everybody to another installment of Being Singular. So this is an online seminar series on singularity hosted by myself, Gregory Moss at CUHK, and Alessandro Di Cesaris from the University of Freiburg in Switzerland. And today we are very lucky to have William Franke as our guest speaker today. So I'll just briefly introduce him to you all, and then we'll give it over to William for the talk. So William Franke is professor of comparative literature and religious studies at Vanderbilt University. He was also professor of philosophy and religions at University of Macau, very close to me, from 2013 to 16. Research fellow at Humboldt, at the Humboldt Stiftung, and was Fulbright University of Salzburg Distinguished Chair in Intercultural Theology and Study of Religions. He was visiting professor at Harvard University Center for Italian Renaissance Studies in Florence, Italy, and many others, but I won't mention them all, but many distinguished appointments. He has his PhD from Stanford in comparative literature, has other degrees, master's degrees from Oxford, Berkeley, both in philosophy and theology and comparative literature. He has many articles, many books. I'm gonna talk about a few of the books now, some of which I have been using for my own research, and I can personally recommend to anyone listening or watching today. The first two books are on What Cannot Be Said, Apophatic Discourses in Philosophy, Religion, Literature, and the Arts, Volume 1 and 2, and you can see those on the screen in front of you. These are wonderful collections. They also have, so they're collections of primary texts on what cannot be said, from ancients to medieval, modern texts, also with some critical essays by William Franke as well. Then there's On the Universality of What Is Not, The Apophatic Turn in Critical Thinking. There it is in front of you. That's, I think, 2000 from 2020. And then we have A Philosophy of the Unsable, Notre Dame Press. Here, I also have a physical copy in hand. I've been using this for my new book. I really highly recommend this book. Very provocative and thought-provoking book. And I think, Alex, you also have another one that you can show as well. Yeah, Dante's Paradiso and the Theological Origins of Modern Thought. There's also a book related to Don Quixote, which has just come out. We were just speaking about it. Don Quixote's Impossible Quest for the Absolute in Literature, Fiction, Reflection, and Negative Theology, which should already be available for purchase. Okay, so today we're happy to hear a talk by William Franke entitled Singularity and Ineffability in Apophatic Perspective. So please, William, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Greg, for that generous introduction, and to Alessandro for the the invitation to participate. I'm going to try to approach this topic from some widely divergent angles, a lot of ground to cover. I take it that's really in the spirit of this series. So let me begin by observing that the singular as a linguistic expression, by virtue of its abstractness, is actually among the most empty and generic of figures, like Hegel's being, which dialectically proves to be equivalent to nothing. Or, the same thing in Plato, Enai, we heard from Pauline Sabrir a few weeks ago. And similarly, the singular I or unique now, when expressed in language, becomes universal. Every singular says I, every singular now is now. To say something is singular does not say anything specific or substantive about it, though it can communicate significant sentiment. It's a little bit like saying to someone that they are special. Approaching the singular through language seems to yield only the absolutely general. A kind of singularity that cannot be defined, that is fundamentally and absolutely recalcitrant to linguistic formulation, might nevertheless be significant in some para or ultra cognitive way. The singular, as I construe it, cannot be defined by adding more and more generic terms. It is at core something else entirely, something indefinable and ineffable. However many qualifiers, black, female, trans, African, Democrat, single, mother, can never capture the singularity of an individual person. All such qualifications are general, shared characteristics. And the allusion there to identity politics is something I want to take up later, um, to bring this really to some contemporary burning political issues. We're going to go through some of the abstract intellectual history of this topic, but with a view to its contemporary relevance. God, too, like the individual in theology, is absolutely singular, indeed, the archetype of all singular being. Of course, God in theology is also the universal ground for the totality that includes all beings and renders their existence possible. God epitomizes the paradox of the universality of singularity. True singularity is perhaps in some sense essentially theological, or best and most originarily understood theologically. This is what Derrida said about the sign, right? L'époque du signe est essentiellement théologique. Religious tradition speaks more often of God as ineffable than as singular. However, in modern times, the category of singularity may be preferred as a cipher of unsayability, the ultimately real, because it seems to be oriented to the concrete individual rather than to some kind of abstract universality. Our modern bias recognizes empirical phenomena rather than anything ideal or infinite as basic reality. In nominalist systems of thought, only individuals really exist. Only what is singular is deemed real. We're likely inclined today to take the singular to be the real as opposed to our abstractions mediated by concepts and language. Modern thought takes individuals to be singularly real, but may also be cornered into admitting their ineffability. Our ethical and political dilemmas and decisions all hinge on how we relate to this ineffable dimension of the singular. The question of what is most essentially real is not only theoretical, but also has decisive practical implications. The practical sciences of ethics and politics, as recognized by Aristotle, require a kind of practical reason, phronesis, different from theoretical knowledge, episteme, or contemplative wisdom, sophia. Conceptual knowledge is all to some degree abstract and general. Only the exigencies of action require dealing with the absolutely concrete and real. We can conceptualize this absolutely concrete reality as singular, but this, like every concept, is inhabited by a dialectic that destabilizes it and transforms it in further contexts into its opposite. The singular, when formulated and treated in language, turns out to be the opposite of the concrete and has to be recognized as universal and even as ineffable. This can be shown for the singular thing or the singular person, or for reality itself as absolute, and even for its ground, God. While a priori these singularities are defined as absolutely self-identical, on examination they turn out to be impossible to pin down linguistically, except in general, iterable terms. However, rather than rejecting such elusive concepts as vacuous, and that was one strain of the talk that we heard some weeks ago from Pauline Sabrière, it's then useless, perhaps. That's not the route I want to take. Um, you know, rather than considering this to be a check, it intrigues me, these concepts that cannot be given a definite concept. I think that makes them revealing of the nature of the conceivable, the conceptualizable. It's an admission about the nature of all of our concepts. I give a place of honor then to concepts like singularity as indicative and revelatory of the real. Poets have perhaps demonstrated this dialectic best. Poetics of ineffability, in particular, have been prescient in unveiling the paradoxes of singularity as inexpressible. The axis Hölderlin, Mallarmé, Celan can be singled out as developing this kind of poetic thinking in world historically significant ways. I'm going to compare two modern poetic approaches to what is singular and ineffably other. I'm drawing here on an article, The Singular and the Other at the Limits of Language in the Apophatic Poetics of Edmond Jabez and Paul Celan. I think there's a slide on that in New Literary History. And it was really taken up again in A Philosophy of the Unsayable that was shown by Greg. Certainly, singularity and otherness are two good reasons why language might run up against its limits. Might this place at the limits of language prove to be the best place for defining or adumbrating what singularity and alterity, or alternatively oneness and otherness, could possibly mean? Although a clear abstract grammatical sense can be assigned to both terms of each of these oppositions, what singularity or otherness might concretely mean, not just as concepts, but as incarnate in discourse and as actually encountered in experience, can perhaps not be elucidated at all, except in terms of the way they exceed language and its furthest capacities to define and describe. The singularity and otherness of another individual are perhaps precisely what I cannot describe about him, her, they, it, or whoever. At least that is as much as can be thought and conceived about them. Just this singular alterity is what cannot be appropriated in any general terms, and all our language is general. Grammatically, I is every I. Likewise, I cannot articulate the absolute ownmost particularity of the other without universalizing it. Classical rhetoric expresses this in the motto individuum ineffabilis est. It is only in relinquishing the claim of language to comprehend and convey the singular, the other individual, that I can perhaps witness to an authentic experience of their alterity. Or perhaps it is not even an experience that is witnessed to so much as the check to experience, the experience of the impossibility of experience vis-a-vis this alterity. My language can transmit nothing of this alterity or singularity as such. It is only in dismantling its claim to represent the other that it can create a space for the singular alterity of the other to express itself and so bear witness to it. This account describes some ineluctable limits posed by language in the relation to another person. No universal concept or logos can ever do justice to the singular individual. Such is the motive of Levinas's ethical critique of logos philosophy. Are these limits confirmed by the discourses of the poets, or do the poets perhaps, in the magic of poetic language, manage, after all, to say the unsayable and communicate something of the otherness of the other in its infinite singularity? Might they betray by indiscretion, as Levinas puts it, what logical language cannot say? Arguably, the rational limits of language can be transcended by poetic language, which is what has given it its peculiar fascination for proponents of contemporary apophaticism, for thinkers such as Blanchot, Derrida, and Levinas himself. Even though Levinas aims to establish ethical limits that would not be exceeded, but rather confirmed by poetry, especially the ethically engaged and absolutely intense poetry of Paul Celan. It seems that poetry excels only in the expression of inexpressibility, and that this alone paradoxically becomes the mode in which the sense of alterity and singularity can be communicated. Not by being communicated, but rather by being marked as evading all linguistic formulations. The inexpressible is made at least to show up in poetry. As in Wittgenstein's dictum, the inexpressible shows itself, right? It is das Mystische, the mystical. What then specifically are the means by which Celan and Jabez evoke the unsayable as the marker of a singularity or alterity that cannot as such be expressed? One means is simply the function of language as an index, plain, unadorned referentiality in the most basic sense. Although much is often made of the loss of referentiality in poetry like Celan's, in fact, the unspeakable horror is often enough pointed to, as if poet and reader alike were on site in the fields of the death camps. It is not what the poems say, but what they point to and decline to say, or prove incapable of saying, that bears the burden of their pathos and perhaps even exceeds every pathetic mode of poetic expression in the face of the unbearable and inexpressible. For Celan, the unsayable is most obviously outside language in that which happened. It cannot be expressed, those are his words, das was geschah. It cannot be expressed, but can be indicated mutely in a sort of pure absolute reference. Accordingly, Celan counsels his reader in Engführung to stop reading and rather see, and then to stop seeing and rather go. Context overwhelms text, and in fact threatens to cancel it out completely, overrunning and crushing or voiding it. The Holocaust, in this way, has a very direct, unmasterable pertinence for nearly all of what Celan writes. It is the historical context that gives meaning to his poetry, sometimes even by depriving it of literal sense. The violations of grammatical and lexical norms that make Celan's expressions so often veer into nonsense or a surplus of sense resonate with this larger significance of bearing witness to the incomprehensible in Holocaust history and even mimetically reenacting its destructiveness on a linguistic plane. The Holocaust experience his poetry revolves around stands as the incomparable that which happened, that it is impossible to say or name. But this historical catastrophe is not really accessible as history and is not only an event in the past. In its very uniqueness and incomparability, it becomes for Celan the key to interpreting the situation of human beings at all times, that is simply as in time which is always catastrophic by its very nature. It is the nature of time to isolate moments of encounter, Begegnung, of the wholly other into their strange, uncanny, incomprehensible singularity. This singular reality can be touched only in a unique, irrecuperable, and incomprehensible encounter. In einmal, right, let's look at that, once, Celan approaches something infinitely singular, and he does so literally through annihilations enacted in and upon language. It is by linguistically interrupting and destructing the one and infinite that an unconditional singularity is allowed first to emerge. Once I heard him. He was washing the world, unseen, night long, real. One and infinite, annihilated, eyed, light was salvation. The cleansing annihilation of the one and infinite, eins und unendlich, occurs in the breakdown of language, its fragmentation into syllables, imitating time as disjunctive, as producing an incomparable, unintegratable once. In this way, the singular once of einmal can wash the world, da wusch die Welt, of generalization and its fictions. This happens blindly, unseen, during the night, nachtlang, where language cannot grasp or reach with the light of its logos. The word for annihilates, vernichtet, actually engulfs a word for something, the particle ich from Middle High German it, something, ought, as opposed to niet, not. Every something is annihilated by the breaking up of language in this poem. However, icht is then recycled to ichten, and then further relayed to licht, light, suggesting ways that the breakdown of language into syllables first lets something be and even show itself in the daylight. This light is itself in turn salvation or redemption, Rettung. These rich connotations, squeezed from an act of linguistic dismemberment and reincorporation, thus attain finally to a religious register of meaning. As in the Kabbalistic theory of creation by divine contraction, only the annihilation of the infinite and one by self-withdrawal permits something to exist in its uniqueness. Furthermore, also embedded in Ich is the word Ich, German for I. The I, as verbally enacted by being made a participle, ichten, I'd in English, in this, in this poem, emerges in its singularity and is illuminated by the linguistic annihilation of the one and infinite. The obliteration of the quintessentially linguistic categories or abstractions of oneness and infiniteness issues in the emergence into the light of a singular subject, linguistic, lyric, or existential, as the case may be. This I. Celan experiences the radical singularity and incommunicability of this I in annihilations of language, of the unity and generality and even infinity, as in the infinitive, that language alone makes possible and imposes on the world. One and infinite may be the nature of the singular, but paradoxically, these words may be verbally annihilated in order that the oneness and infinity of singular existence be freed, redeemed, brought to light. This can happen only in a singular moment, once. It can happen only in time, in the once that only the breaking of language can release and allow to be perceived, heard. In his discourses on poetics, Celan speaks of encountering himself by writing from or to a specific date, his 20th of January, the day on which the Nazi Party met and formally decided on the final solution, the liquidation of the Jewish race. This time emblematic for annihilation is the reality that Celan approaches over and over again in his poems. By breaking out of all constructions that identify us by words, we enter into real time, which is a breaking and abolishing of every continuous settled narrative that encloses time between the set meanings of a beginning and an end. Celan parallels and perhaps depends on Walter Benjamin's theory of messianic time as a discontinuous eruptive now, Jetztzeit. The poem, as a breaking open of language, first enables this open time of the break to transpire. In this sense, poems are underway, unterwegs. Toward what? Toward something open, inhabitable, an approachable you, perhaps, an approachable reality. That last sentence is a citation from Meridian by Celan. This you, however, is radically unknowable and can be designated only as other. The quote from Celan once again. The poem intends another, needs this other, needs an over against. It goes toward it, speaks it. For the poem, everything and everybody is a figure of this other toward which it is heading. End quote. Indeed, the poem and everything in it is to be understood only in terms of this intention moving toward an other that no word can name, but that every word intends and adumbrates. Hence, what the poem approaches is described as the altogether other, ganz andere. Vis-a-vis this wholly other, language is reduced to silence. This happens in amazing ways in virtually every poem Celan writes. As he himself puts it, the poem today exhibits a strong tendency toward growing dumb, no, verstummen. The poem can only approach and bespeak, not say or express, this altogether other. For this, there can be no words, only the failing and foundering of words, accented or seconded by their artfully deliberate dissection and destruction, can express this intention directed toward the wholly other. Language vis-a-vis this wholly other can grasp and express nothing properly in name and concept, but rather, quote, passes through terrifying silence, through the thousand darknesses of murderous speech. The language Celan writes of and himself writes, quote, went through. It gave me no words for what was happening, but went through it, went through and could resurface enriched by it all, end quote. Even growing dumb in relation to unspeakable happenings can enrich language by its brush with a historical reality that it cannot represent. For Chavez, in contrast, it is not the unutterable density or plenitude of the historically concrete, nor even of the personally incarnate, the singular individual, that escapes articulation, but rather the essence and reality of language itself. Everything that is anything is by virtue of the word, for the word alone gives it definition as something, apart from the doctrine of the creation by the word. In this sense, the word alone is unconditionally, yet the word itself is essentially a cipher. It is not. It is not. Language is an articulation of nothing concrete or given apart from the positings of language itself. Language is a regress to infinity, what Jabez calls the book, and as such collapses into what can never be made manifest except in and through the negation of every finite representable form or object. Living in constant and total relation to the book, the Jews are exiled from every would-be concrete, definite reality, every fixed and stable home. Exile for Jabez means primarily not being a solitary individual separate from others in history, but exile of and into the Word. Language opens a space of emptiness, since all that it posits, strictly considered, it posits as absent, as only verbally posited, as therefore virtual and ideal. The verbal is, in this sense, a universe of emptiness. Le verbe est univers de vide. Bound to and separated by their special relation to the divine name, the Jews are exiled into the name, and they thereby become literally nomads, no name nomads, where the wholly unsayable, that's holy and holy in the religious sense as well, divine name reigns. Every given finite form is sacrificed to the infinite, ungraspable, and incomprehensible, the totality of language in the book. This is a purely virtual totality that is beyond all possibility of articulation. Like God, it is unencompassable in its infinity and is signified only by the silence of the name of God. Every word, therefore, with its concrete sensorial and semantic content, is given up for and is beholden to silence. The Jews then are descendants of the name that is located nowhere, at no stable or ascertainable place in real space or geography. Not only does nom, name, through its incorporation of nomad, intimate that language is a nomadic condition of perpetual exile, the word nom is also mon, the first person possessive pronoun, my, backwards. And this is, I want to have you look at another quotation here. Non should be read twice, from left to right and from right to left, because it is composed of two words, non, name, and mon, my name. The name is mine. Every name is personal. This convertibility of nom and mon hints at the way that the name is always an indirect, backhanded sort of appropriation. Whatever is named is in some manner also possessed. The struggle of Jacob with the angel is a good illustration of that in Genesis. Articulate speech begins only with such appropriation, which is ineluctably destruction of the purity of silence abiding at the unsayable center from which language emanates. This silent source of language would presumably be an anonymous foundation for all constructions of names, ultimately the total structure of the book. Indeed, the common noun for book, livre, and in here there's another Jabez slide that I think it will help to look at. Livre turns out, like the adjective for free, libre, to be subject to voiding at its center. By suppressing their central letter, livre, book, and libre, free, are pared down equally to lire, the infinitive, to read. And then by further hollowing out, eliminating all but the first and last letter in each word to le, the singular masculine definite article for generically designating whatever is anything at all. at least in Old French. That status is now very much under scrutiny and being challenged. But le, reversed, is also the Hebrew name of God, El. In this manner, the Hebrew name of God, which is in principle silent and unpronounceable, is found at the core of the book and of reading and of naming in general, and so of language itself. Jabez works with French in the way that Kabbalah writers worked with the Hebrew language, finding presumably mystical truths of the universe inscribed within it. Ostensible contingencies of the French language are presented as miraculously revealing the mystery of creation by the name of God, the empty and unpronounceable divine name that creates all from nothing. But whereas Kabbalists supposed that Hebrew was the language of creation itself, Jabez uses French to show how the self-subversive forms and fictive powers of a human vernacular mirror an undelimited power of creativity from nothing. Jabez exposes the operation in language as such of the power of creation from nothing that was traditionally attributed to the divine word. Jabez's thought unfolds entirely within the book as the boundary and abyss of language, and the Holocaust impinges in the sense that, in any of its manifestations, the book is inflected as subject to destruction and infinite nullification. As well as being a contingent event befalling the Jews, the Holocaust is experienced at another level as evacuation of reality by the word, as an offering up of beings to the nothing of language. Language by itself being an empty representation, right? An airy nothing, a mere form. This takes place already paradigmatically in the book as a transcendent totality that cannot but be absent from any ensemble of words, however complete, as well as absent from any history and from the world of finite entities. The obliteration in the book of any immediately present reality is unmediated by the word and its emptiness, is a general condition of the Holocaust, of annihilation by and sacrifice to the word, even apart from being a singular historical event. Jabez's poetics of the inexpressible, in contrast to Celan's, pivot not so much or so directly on an extra-linguistic singularity or otherness, as on the book. Like the Neoplatonic one, another all-nothing, the book is infinite and can be manifest only in fragments and finitude, never as a whole and intact. In finite terms, the book is nothing, that is, nothing finite can express it, and every word taken as a word of the book cannot but be empty. The emptiness of the word, as abstracted and separated from the reality of things, and as belonging to the book, opens into the omnipresent infinity of nothing. The Jews, by dwelling in this exile of the word, are veritably the people of the book. This infinity and emptiness of the word, as well as its totalization, the book, is unsayable. But it is open in its emptiness as an open question and an open desert for wandering, a space of errancy. Only in this openness is there any room for human expression. Whereas Celan most often approaches the unsayable from the side of what language cannot say, with the unspeakable of the Shoah directly present before him and obliterating word and image before they begin to express it, Jabez typically approaches unsayability from the side of language. Jabez's problem is not that there is no language for the singular reality that beggars description, but rather that language, as it can be used by humans, is singularly nothing, because it is not everything, not the book, not God. The singularity that occupies Jabez is discovered first and foremost within language, rather than apart from and outside of language and as inaccessible to it. In Ceylon, the singularities inherent in language seem to function as analogues for the incomparable, unspeakable singularity of a historical catastrophe, the Shoah, that no language can reach or articulate. Jabez, by contrast, seems to acknowledge no outside of language, For him, rather, words themselves are already inhabited by singularity and alterity that nullify every positive content. They possess no territory and stand on no secure soil. They fall away from and destroy themselves and reduce to nothing articulable, to the silence of the absolutely singular and other that is in their midst and at the same time engulfs them entirely. But in either case, grasping and expressing the singular requires a kind of revelation, poetic or even religious. All our language is general, all our conceptual knowledge is abstract. It may be that only theological revelation can penetrate deeper into singular being, although revelation by the poetic word may be able to simulate such knowing. Dante's Paradiso furnishes compelling examples, and a programmatic thesis about singularity shows up at certain flashpoints in the poem. One is the singular case of Ripheus, the Trojan hero, who is, he's in paradise, right? We're in the heaven of the just. He was designated by Virgil Justissimus Unus. That's all it said about him in the Aeneid. Dante picks up on that. That's all we know. But so he's in the heaven of justice. But how can that be? Right? It's a violation of the law of no salvation outside of Christ. Dante wants it there in order to say, well, singularity can actually exceed all of the laws of the of damnation or of blessedness. The exception is what he is highlighting here. Trajan, the Roman Empire, is another exception treated in this manner, beyond all calculations. And I wanted to show the passage, Quale alludeta, which comes right after the allusion to to Ripheus. And this cannot be explained. How could this is an absolute surprise. Dante sort of covers over the logical gap with a lyrical transport, referring here to the lark. Um, Now, let's see, I'm not seeing this. Okay, there we go. As if it were a lark at large in air, a lark that sings at first and then falls still, right? It's lyrical exuberance, but it relates to this moment of silence and it's actually aimed towards that content with final sweetness that fulfills. Such seemed to me to be the image of the seal of that eternal pleasure through whose will, right? This is l'eterno piacere, that's God, and through whose will each thing becomes the being that it is, right? The singular entity, ciascuna cosa quale lei diventa. There's this mirroring here. I also wanted just to point out that this language is self-reflexive. I'm going to have to talk about that in a few minutes, but si spazia, it's the self-reflexivity of language is the key, I think, to creating a language of the unsayable that relates to what what is unsaid out of language's own resources. Now, I also wanted, well, in the Paradiso here, just to point out that each blessed soul, they all share in this. There's another slide here, right there. Then I saw faces given up to love, graced with another's light. It's actually the Virgin Mary's face, I think, which is illuminating the whole celestial rose, right? This great amphitheater and all the blessed, but their own smile, right? They all refract it in an individual way. And even the angels, because look, the angels have no matter, right? Pure intellect. Uh, how can they be individuated is an enormous problem in medieval theology. But ciascun distinto di fulgore ed arte, each was distinct in splendor and in manner, I would say, in skill. I don't know, l'arte. It's sort of, in any case, Dante what does want to underline that even each angel has its own individual degree and quality of beatitude. So the poetry shows, right? We've gone through three different paradigms here, a kind of a gap between being or existence and language. That is the fundamental epistemological break, which also enables us to connect with the non-objectifiable sources from which reality originates. On this break cum juncture hinges apophatic thinking. My own, but I think like Damascus or Eckhart or Cusanus or Dionysius the Areopagite. The negation of language and language as inherently negation is the only indicator pointing to the absoluteness or singularity of being, whether in the world, Celan, or in language, Jabez. And both perspectives I suggest are combined in Dante. The singularity that we can say and even imagine is composed wholly of generic qualities, but we intend the unique being of an existent. This pole of the existent, which stands out among others, seems to stand against the pole of the mystical one, which is also singularly ineffable. Only anything that is something can be said. Which ineffable singularity then are we talking about? Is singularity determinate or indeterminate? Individual or supracategorical? Apophatic thinking does not want to choose, but rather evokes the indistinct unity, or rather non-duality, from which these alternatives stem and branch out in opposing directions. Can apophatic singularity, as a coincidentia oppositorum, be infinitely determinate and indeterminate? The apophatic singular is the universal, since all individuals are singular, but this universal singularity remains an undefined and indefinable universal, like human freedom. Hegel's dialectic produces the singular individual from the dialectic of the universal and the particular. This dialectic can be grounded in finite entities, and in this case, true being is finite. For Hegel, true finitude coincided with an infinite whole. However, the dialectic of the finite and the infinite can be opened infinitely to a being that remains always beyond human determination and is infinite. Being as infinite was the formula for God as conceived by medieval scholastic philosophy or theology, and in an especially world historically significant manner by Duns Scotus. Scotus rejects the analogy of being, designed to relate finite to infinite being by proportionate analogy, because there is no proportion between the finite and the infinite. Instead, he maintained that a univocal concept of being could be neutral between the finite and the infinite, determining itself as neither one nor the other. And I think we could trace this really to Le Neutre of Blanchot, Bartre, as kinds of distant echoes here. This indeterminate status would seem to be the opposite of singularity as we know it. We expect concrete determinations to mark out an individual singularity as distinct from all others. However, this procedure for individuation uses qualities that are all general in nature, always capable of being shared by other individuals. It is only the combination that can be unique to a certain individual, and such combinations are always in principle replicable, as are our social identities. Such singularity is always precarious, not absolute. Only an indefinable singularity can be absolute. This is the case for the human person and for God, the ineffable, the unnameable, exemplarily in medieval negative theology. God is the absolutely unique beside which there is no other, although God is nothing that can be properly defined. Likewise, what we all share in common is our nothingness, beyond any universal predicates or determinations. Every individual being, in its deepest indefinable core, can also be absolutely singular in this indefinable sense. I want to try and think singularity in this manner as an alternative to our intuitively modern approaches to thinking singularity. I call this an apophatic approach. It's based on critical rationality, but is self-critical without limits, so that it critiques and exceeds rationality towards an indefinable, incomprehensible kind of revelation. Negative theology since antiquity developed this kind of thinking. Duns Scotus provides a positive metaphysics that will be embraced as such by subsequent tradition from Spinoza all the way to Deleuze. He then embraces through faith also a positive theology of revelation. On both counts, he seems to be the opposite of a negative or apophatic theologian. However, that's a quintessentially apophatic gesture, negating oneself. And if it's negative theology has to negate itself as negative theology. While Duns Scotus separates reason and faith, he furnishes incomparably useful tools for forging a rational negative theological openness to revelation. Now, I see Dante as paralleling Duns Scotus, his exact contemporary, by the way, in opening the modern world of singularities, relating to an inaccessible divine absolute through fashioning conceptual systems, science for Duns, or metaphorical constructions, poetry for Dante, that reinvent the world through self-reflexive concept formation and image formation as well. The two are even inseparable. In either case, a formal reality is created by self-reflexive conceptual construction. Duns and Dante, both born in 1265, a generation after Aquinas, and both are responding to the crisis of the medieval analogical worldview, specifically the collapse of the analogia entis. They enter into and usher in a secular era where revelation no longer furnishes objective scientific knowledge of God by analogy. Only univocity can yield scientific knowledge for Duns. This new worldview is catalyzed by Arab Aristotelian science in the 13th century. The secular world becomes knowable on its own terms, whereas God and his angels, purely intellectual essences, are beyond human ken by natural means, right? Grounded in the senses. Natural and revealed knowledge no longer form a unified whole. The Thomistic synthesis comes apart. Duns' metaphysics is a knowledge of transcendental concepts, starting from the univocal concept of being, that are produced by the mind self-reflexively, just as Dante's paradisiacal metaphorics is an unscientific knowledge of God mediated by the inextricably personal experience and witness of a knowing subject. Dante's visio Dei is conveyed in terms of a sensory universe realized through a self-reflexive act of poetic creation. The Paradiso subjectively refracts an ineffable experience of a mystical encounter with God. Scotus and Dante are progenitors, respectively, of our two cultures of technoscience, on the one hand, and interpretive humanities, on the other, out of a common predicament of secularization, cutting off worldly knowledge from communication directly with its outside, its other, the transcendent, and forming an immanent secular sphere sufficient unto itself. But for Dante and Dante, still in relation to an outside to God that it can no longer scientifically grasp. For Scotus, we can know only the abstract concept of being in general. This concept is produced by the mind and is limited in its validity to the mind's own subjective way of construing the world. It is transcendental, imposed by the mind, in the sense that endures through Kant, right? The conditions of the possibility of knowing. But within the mind's own grasp, and it imposes and structures experience. It's transcendental, imposed by the mind rather than being a category of being itself. Although Scotus remained, nevertheless, a staunch metaphysical realist, the anti-metaphysical or nominalist potential of this fundamental and far-reaching innovation, the univocity of being, would be fully exploited only a short time later, already by the logical empiricism of Occam and his followers. This follow-up to and misprision of Scotus was dominated by those who would dispense of any overt metaphysics and eventually even with God. Thus, the path to the modern scientific worldview was opened. The dimension of the singular was lost to scientific knowing, which knows only its own self-engendered conceptual systems. I read Dante is working in the same predicament of loss of scientific knowledge, of ultimate reality, and of God through the analogias entis, yet as devising a subjective poetic approach to such knowledge through metaphor and poetic language, rather than through the abstract concepts of science. But that too is a human artifice, right? Our sciences are conceptual systems. They don't grasp the singularity, the mystery of matter or reality, whatever it is, and there's no way to say it that's not already a conceptual compromise. In both cases, Duns's and Dante's, language and its conceptual system is a human invention by self-reflection. It does not articulate things themselves. We're removed from absolute reality and its singularities, but can develop our own systems for relating to them, either abstractly in science or as imaginable wholes in poetry and more generally in the work of the humanities. Scotus opens a space for experiential and experimental, yet non-linguistic mysticism that also inspires profoundly apophatic innovations and development in the modern age. Movements of affective piety beginning in the 14th century will fill in this space with diverse expressions of ineffably singular experience. Meister Eckhart, like Scotus, and the Beguines, such as Margarete Porete, think in this space of a pragmatic relation to God as ineffably singular. Scotus's concept of heketas, thisness, intends a singularity that is not accessible to linguistic conceptual articulation. It is an ultimate difference that cannot be defined because then it could be broken down further into components shared with other individuals. Also, intrinsic modes of being, in infinite being, God, and finite being in the Aristotelian categories are the indescribable ultimate differences. Here, I'm going to draw really from the work of Andrew Lazzella, The Singular Voice of Being, Duns Scotus, and Ultimate Difference. Singularity changes fundamentally as we move from the medieval to the modern age, and then again to the postmodern, which reopens certain pre-modern possibilities, such as I find in Dante. For Scotus, the divine essence is singularissima. It is not vague indeterminacy. Lazzella writes, quote, for Scotus, infinite is not vague or indeterminate boundlessness, but a determinate wholeness of perfection that cannot be exceeded, end quote. This idea, or rather ideal of the infinite as a completed whole, is taken up by Hegel, who contrasts it with the bad infinite, die schlechte Unendlichkeit, of indeterminate infinity. Lazzella once more, I'm going to quote, the infinite for Scotus is instead a determinate amount or degree of a virtual quantity. Its amount or degree is one of perfect excess, end quote. It's perfect because it cannot be increased or exceeded, unlike all finite magnitudes. I maintain, however, that for us, in our language, such an infinite cannot be adequately determined or expressly stated. Its excess can be indicated only by language's own indeterminacy. Such infinity forces language, as in the discourses of the poets we examined, to determine itself as indeterminate. Singularity cannot be reified. Scotus treats it as absolutely determinate, yet not in language and not as a thing, but rather as an intensity of ultimate difference. Hegel's dialectic producing the singular individual is mostly used today to reinscribe the universal within the world of particularity. Maybe Zizek would be an example there. The singular individual produced by the dialectic of the universal and the particular is a particular individual, but one with a universal scope or capacity of identification. We can do the inverse operation in a postmodern, post-secular age and make all particular being a partial manifestation of the universal. The resulting singularity is not linguistically differentiated as a concretely existing determined individual, but is rather an indeterminate potential to become all such individual things or beings, as in Schelling's idea of the essence of human freedom, or das Wesen der menschlichen Freiheit. This is perhaps more truly what we are, universal freedom of all alike, than any list of our objective determinations. I illustrate the importance of this inversion by considering the social identities constructed and claimed by the social justice agenda that we have encountered recently in what can be called the woke movement. And here there's another manuscript. It's actually supposed to be out next month. 22 May was given to me as the date. Social Justice and Social Identities, Reconceiving Ethics and Politics in the Wake of Wokeism is what I'm going to draw from now in this last concluding segment. Identity politics covers over the essential dimension of the singular and ineffable. It focuses attention to individuals on general characteristics of race or gender or other social identities. Much deeper, we are all equal as nothing. This common humanity, like any universal, notwithstanding its being real, is only potential and nothing positively present or definable or fixed. It is ultimately a non-identity, and that accounts for its being generally overlooked and ignored, shunted aside by more officiously visible, affable identities. We need to recuperate the negative theology, knowledge of our ignorance of God, that is the hidden source of the biblical revelation and that makes all of us truly equal in our essential non-identity, our intrinsic inalienable nothingness before God, or the ultimately real, and one another, before one another. The kenotic self-emptying of our identity, reducing it to the nothing in particular that we all truly share in common, and that is deeper than whatever our identifying and distinguishing characteristics may be, is the way forward out of a culture of resentment predicated on irreconcilable conflict between oppressors and oppressed, colonizers and colonized, or other irresolvably invidious identifications. Generic social identities, by their differential and exclusive nature, cannot take the lead in structuring interactions among human beings without polarizing and alienating them. Such identities can be a tremendous enrichment of our humanity, but only when they are brought in as inflections of something else, something mysterious and indefinable, our singularity that is already recognized as the nothing, nothing nameable or definable that is common to us all. Called for is not a politics of explicit identitarian revindications, but rather an apophatic ethics, an ethics of unsaying, literally away from apo speech phases, that leaves differential divisive identities out of the equation in attempting to negotiate fairly among all parties participating in society. All parties have a right to equal consideration as non-identically equal and as, in fact, singularly incommensurable. Justice without exclusions is indeed the goal. But for that to come about, we need to start from recognition of the non-identical that all share in common. This means the indefinable infinite mystery at the core of each individual, their singularity, rather than our differential identities defined and asserted over against one another. The latter, while seemingly concrete immediate realities, are actually shifting social constructions that are inevitably used for manipulation in the interests of brokering power and procuring privileges. Our singularity is where we are all the same and equal. We are all equally, or rather incommensurably, singular. This is also the dimension of our universality. Non-identity singularizes us, and this non-oppositional and rather in this non-oppositional, universally shared way. Just one last thought here. Singularity, like any term that intends to designate something absolute, ends up contradicting itself in the course of spelling out in language all its implications. Absolute is precisely what cannot be designated by any terms, which are necessarily oppositional and divisive. Thus, the singular pursued far enough, through definition, turns out to have nothing specifiably singular about it at all, but to consist in purely indeterminate and universal potential. As a linguistic category, like all linguistic categories, singularity is based on artificial abstraction, a blending out of the whole relational context that makes anything what it is. Yet its production of contradiction may be the best indicator of the singularly ineffable, enigmatic nature of the real. I will stop there and and let us debate. Thank you.
Thank you so much, William, for that really rich and inspiring talk on the singular and the ineffable. So let's go this way. Who has a question, you can simply use the react button down at the bottom of the screen and raise your virtual hand, or you can physically raise your hand and I'll look out for you on the video. And if you're on YouTube, you can also just put your question in the chat, and then I can read your question for you. There are a few people watching on YouTube right now. So let's start with the Zoom room, and then if there aren't questions, I'll go to YouTube. So questions in the Zoom call. Yeah, Alex, how about you can go ahead and get started, Alex?
Yeah, thank you, Greg. I can break the ice, so to speak. Thank you, William. This was very, very inspiring. And I mean, I have so many questions, so I will. I have four precisely. So it's not just general, too many. I have four, but I will start with just one, and maybe which is maybe more of a clarification question. And I was very much interested in this differential analysis you provided between Edmond Jabès and Paul Celan. If I got it, the difference being between, so to say, the ineffable singularity of the content be expressed by the poetic language and the singularity of poetic language itself, so to say. So the singularity of poetry itself, and it made me it reminded me of a book I really much liked. I don't know whether what you thought of it, by Ben Lerner, the Hatred of Poetry, where he has uh, this interesting idea of poetry as structurally um, aiming at expressing the inexpressible, structurally aiming at saying the ineffable. So, a point by Lerner is this idea that good poetry always says something about its own insufficient, so to say, uh, result. So, the good
What means?
poetry always, sorry?
Well, you go ahead. No, no, I was suggesting another word means, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, yeah, precisely. So the idea, yeah, precisely. The insufficient means, so precisely. So the idea that good poetry always um, tells by telling that telling is not sufficient in a way. And yet on the other side, I was thinking about another theory of poetry that maybe is slightly different from what you suggested by commenting Jabez, and I wanted to know what you thought. I was thinking about Giorgio Agamben's theory of, so to say, poetry as intensity. So the idea that I mean, there are many theories of poetry, and I've only read some. I'm not an expert in this, but they have to do with aesthetics in general, so to say, that in a way argue that what happens in poetry is that language itself is made singular, because what really counts, what really is meaningful is not really the content you are expressing, but rather the event of language, so to say, the happening of language. But I feel it's very different from what Jabez says, because I mean, it's in a way, it's not this idea of, I mean, every poem not being the whole of language, because in a way, the whole of language. I don't know Jabez, so I'm just commenting what you said if I understand something from it. But in Jabez, there is still an exteriority in a way. So, meaning by addressing this whole of language, in a way, you end up saying, yes, every poem is insufficient because it does not express the whole of language. But in a way, there is another way of understanding the singularity of poetry. That is, no, the poetic expression is singular precisely because it's not meaningful in the sense that it expresses something outside of itself, but because the word in itself becomes an event. And I wanted to know whether this has anything to do with, yes, with this beautiful differential analysis you provided.
Yeah. No, I love the idea of poetry being the singularization of language, and I do see poetry that way. Of course, there's a sort of normative idea of poetry. It maybe doesn't fit everything that everyone wants to call poetry, but I think that really cuts to the essence. And no, thanks for bringing that theory into play. I actually don't want to over schematize here Jabez and Celan. I've used them to illustrate two different paradigms of unsayability, through or in poetic language. But I wouldn't say that the one excludes the other. And
Mhm.
sure, in Jabez, there's an outside, an internal outside. We're always an exile in the word, right, within language. And, um, those structures of inside outside are going to reproduce themselves. That's the dialectic that's that's at play. Um, I really wanted to use Celan and Jabez to illustrate different approaches. We can really emphasize some sort of externality, referentiality, or we can find the unsayable really within language, and it's, this event of language that produces an outside. When language happens, accadersi, um, produces itself as a singular event, it actually goes outside itself. That's a very Hegelian kind of a move as well, of the logos incarnating itself, and emptying itself out of language into the world, a kenotic movement. So yeah, no, I find those, that's only your first question, but very, 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 very suggestive. And I think the point to be clarified is that I want to illustrate these different angles of approach, through Celan and Jabez, but that they're not going to remain rigidly apart. And yeah, thanks for bringing up, one way in which they're going to coalesce, crossover with the idea
Thank you.
of language as the singular, or poetry as the singular event of language. Very, very valuable idea. So maybe, yeah, if
Had
we can
more
give a
questions.
chance to someone else,
Yeah.
or go on to, two,
There's
3, and 4.
No, no,
there.
no, no. I wanted to stop here. No, no, thank you.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, please.
Let me go on. There's a question on YouTube, but let me read this one. It's from Alvin. Thank you for very inspiring thoughts. I have one question. Do you have any remarks regarding the archaic oral poetry? How do you see orality versus scripture in challenging the boundaries of cognition?
Yeah. Well, a wonderful question. Thank you. And an immense topic. I want to try to see orality and scripture in relation to each other. Our notion of orality is recuperated through scripture to a large extent, uh, to the extent that we are not living any longer in an archaic age where our relationship to word and language would be purely oral, though we want to try and imagine that. And of course, we do it always from within now our, um, scriptural culture, which is transforming itself into something else, with informatics today as well. So it's one lens, however, that certainly determines how we can see, orality as a kind of original revelation. I like to talk about the word as revelation, and the poetic word, um, in archaic cultures. I think the word per se is being poetic as a making of world, that is creating a relationship between a a mind and what surrounds it. Um, the Vico is somebody who imagines all of this in great detail and theoretical depth, how language originates archaically with even sort of, pre-humanoids, who see the lightning and they're frightened. And they express it with sounds. This is the beginning, or Zeus, Zeus, the word for the god would be an imitation of the sound of lightning ripping through the heavens. Um, I love to try to think from those archaic origins to illuminate the nature of poetic language as we have it today. And I'll mention another poet. I think his name did come up, Mallarmé. Um, the symbolist, French symbolism culminates in some ways in Mallarmé, and I think his language, for all of its super sophistication at sort of the decadent era of modernity, is reaching back to recover some of these archaic energies of language. And it wasn't a part of this talk, but it's very much a part of my thinking on poetic language. There are various. I think there's an encyclopedia article on this very topic of archaic forms like magic, spells, incantations, and you mentioned orality. Um, there's a whole discourse just on that, really, to be made. I've kind of broadened the question into various forms of archaic language with this poetic potential, and how that relates to the revelatory capacities of language, which, we were much more tuned into the revelatory capacities of language before our rationalizing machine, really, that we've created, and that our information culture is, not ratcheting up to the nth degree, to the detriment of our awareness of what language is originally at that archaic oral stage. So thank you very much for calling up that absolutely crucial dimension. Thank you.
Very good. before I take the pleasure of asking the next question, I will give anyone in the Zoom call a chance to skip ahead of me in line. Okay, well, if I see someone, then I will cede the floor, but I think I will go ahead and ask the next question. So thank you so much.
I had you in mind with, there's a lot of references to Hegel. I think we're going to have to hash some of this out.
Well, I will ask you about that, but that will
Okay,
be
yeah,
my third question.
good.
I really I was very yeah, I've had a long day. It's been very exhausting, but you woke me up, and I was very yeah, very pleased that you're contributing this talk on ineffability in the singular. I think it's really important theme, absolutely essential, or non-essential because one can't speak of it successfully.
Mm,
Not even essential or non-essential.
mm,
I want to ask you maybe three questions. The first one is about the singularity of God and the idea of God as the one and only singular, or thinking about the singularity of the absolute, um, in which we think of the absolute as relative to nothing, as a singularity that's somehow by itself. And I want to ask you about this in relation to contradiction. You mentioned contradiction at the very end, and it seemed to be present throughout the whole talk, however. Um, when we try to speak of the singular with the universal, of course, we universalize the non-universal. We get a contradiction when we try to define the indefinable, we get a contradiction, right? We're equalizing the non-equal, and we're falling into contradiction time and again. And one of the things I was thinking about is, what's the role of contradiction in the way that language shows the singular? When we think about how language can show what cannot be said, um, contradiction seems to me to be one way that language can show it, right? Through the breaking down, through the inability to successfully articulate something is shown. And I was thinking back to an old assumption made by Aristotle that if contradictions were true, all the distinctions would collapse. And one might want to use that against him by saying something like, well, yeah, I tried to speak about the singular and I fall into contradiction. And the collapse of the distinctions actually shows the the undifferentiated nature of the singular, or it shows the the singularity of the singular, that is God. So I'm wondering whether, in fact, the breaking down of language in contradiction, that what it really shows is the one and only indistinctness that is God.
right,
So I'm wondering about the way that contradiction can operate as a way of showing the singular.
right.
And I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on this, because for me, it seems to be intimately, or could be intimately bound to the showing of the singularity of the one and only.
Yeah, I think you're giving a perfect description of contradiction as a figure of apophatic rhetoric.
Yeah, right.
And that really is how I take it, alongside anakoluthon, dot, 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 ellipses is, or, any number of forms of paradox. And I do see, right, contradiction as showing, as revealing, not as a stop sign, and interdiction. I'm interested in what it reveals. Um, and I think to try then to understand, well, what about Aristotle? Are we're supposed to, like, avoid at all contradiction. The law of non-contradiction is the very basis for logical thinking. But logical thinking too is a tool. We're using it in order to try and probe a reality that does not ultimately bend to our logical, but maybe it bend, maybe we can we can sort of construct a relationship with it. And in fact, we do that. And, it's an invaluable tool. Um, sure, any kind of thinking is working with contradiction, non-contradiction. We're trying to reconcile our, divergencies that produce contradictions. But you see, and you're evoking this ultimate dimension of God as perhaps the only singularity. And I guess I like that idea, but I don't want to say it.
I understand.
Um, that is maybe in some sense, there is only, or maybe all singularities are the same singularity in some sense. Like maybe we're all God in some sense. Um, but it's sort of by not saying that we can find ways of realizing it partially, fragmentarily. Um, so, we think in terms of multiplicity of singularities. Um, we can think of them as being, echoes of some sort of absolute singularity. It's our language that separates things and places us within multiplicity. Um, but I do think that we are revolving around. Um, I don't want to really say what reality is. Do I want to say so? Reality is really all one. Well, um, I guess I don't want to
I
to,
understand
to
why you don't want to say it. Yeah,
right,
exactly. Yeah,
but I want to let it be,
yeah,
actually. Um,
yeah. Gelassen night. Nice. Good, good. Yeah, that's really helpful. And yeah, that's very helpful. I want to follow up on the theme of well, if it's okay, I'll just keep going because I have these pressing questions, and here I have you. So here's my opportunity. Here I have
My
you.
pleasure.
I want to follow up and continue with contradiction a little because I was thinking on the one hand, kind of very nicely the way that, yeah, the self-referential aspect of language can, in a way, there's a kind of self-annihilation that can take place, or even a self-realization insofar as language can actually fulfill a function of revealing the singular. So of course, language doesn't have to be violent. It can also be revelatory and all of this. So I see the self-reference, I see the place of contradictions, all very good. I was thinking also about maybe what um, a, a rationalist response to some of the ideas here that would take on board everything you've said somehow, but would draw a different conclusion. And I guess I have two voices in my mind. One is apophatic, and one is hyper-rational. And so now I want the hyper-rational to speak. The apophatic's voice just spoke, and now the hyper-rational will speak. And I was thinking, yeah, every time we speak about the singular disappears, and in its place, the universal arises. But someone might say, well, actually, it's what is showing up every time is just a contradiction, the singular that's not singular, the universal that's not universal, the identity that's not identical. And then I think, there is a successful concept every time. Every time I articulate the same concept, I articulate contradiction. Contradiction is the concept that obtains every time. And then I could imagine maybe a paradoxical rationality saying, well, throw Aristotle away. Law P and C, what is this? It's nothing. That's just a mistake. There's a true concept, and it's a kind of self-contradiction, and it's what's revealed everywhere all the time in all the singulars. This is their real being, is being the individual that's not an individual. And that's the concept that you always find realized. I wonder, like, how would we respond to this, where someone's, it turns out that it is fully effable, simply insofar as contradiction itself, this concept is always what is realized. That's the real locus of rationalism. It's simply we have the wrong logic. So I don't know, like, what are your thoughts about this kind of my hyper rationalist
Oh, and
demon or angel speaking from this side. Yeah.
if we didn't have the hyper rationalist present to the dialogue would end very
Yes.
quickly. We just say, you can't say anything. Um,
Yes.
and this is so Hegelian as well.
It is. But
Is your Hegel hyper rational?
yeah,
I don't think, there's some other Hegels out there,
there are.
especially in our postmodern
Yes.
times. But sort of the classic Hegel was supposed to be hyper rationalist, right?
Yes.
The system of absolute knowing. And as I say, I think that's essential to keep the dialogue going. In a way, even to get it started. I'm presupposing a hyper-rationalist I'm intervening into a hermeneutic field that is already in some way, possessed by a secular paradigm of thinking, a certain kind of rationalism. That's what gives me a point to make
Yes.
with, resurrecting the apophatic.
It's good.
But the hyper rationalist, has to be there to keep the dialogue going. And actually, it's an internal critique. There's the hyper rationalist is within my own discourse. Um, it's really by going through hyper rationalism that I come to this apophatic opening, and it's always by a infinite self-critique. That really is the that I use. It's critical thinking, negative theology, and that's literally apophatic theology, apophasis, negation, is critical thinking. It says all of your ideas about God are idolatrous. So you get some sort of you take a critical distance from them. You become self-critical. And, the hyper, I guess what I say to the hyper rationalist is that, that the hyper rationalist has to critique reason as well and open the dialogue to the other of
Yeah.
reason
Right. Right. Exactly.
by its own rational logic.
Yes. I like this last point that you make because when you're the hooper, I don't know, maybe I
Right.
should make my hyper a hooper, but maybe I'll make
Yeah.
a hooper in the kind of pseudo-Dionysian spirit of the super,
Right.
or Eriugena or something. That yeah,
Mhm.
if in fact the concept of contradiction really is always being realized in everything that's said, and the hyper-rational say, you see, it's all effable. If it really is contradictory, then I suppose then it should equally be ineffable and equally be non-conceptual, just as much as it's conceptual or effable, right? So it has to open itself up to its other. Exactly in succeeding, it must also fail, as you say. And so we're back in the ineffability again, but as you say, through the uh Hooper-Noose, if you allow me to
Mhm.
make up some terms there. So that makes good sense to me. That makes very good sense to me.
Yeah, no, and thanks for your,
Yeah,
reflecting back your
yeah,
formulations. Yeah,
yeah. It's good.
very
And
good.
maybe I'll just ask one question about the political angle at the very end, which I really was it was really wonderful for you to connect the very abstract and as you say, theme of the singularity, which is on the one hand very abstract and formal, on the other hand trying to say something that is the negation or the opposite of the abstract, back to the contemporary political questions. I was very sympathetic to the critique of identity politics, and it makes good sense to it's a very, I think, effective critique. Then I was thinking back to the master slave dialectic and thinking about how how somebody might be worried or respond to this kind of point. I was also thinking about Sartre as well, actually. I had to teach him recently, and his understanding of intersubjective relations. And I was thinking about one of Hegel's concerns in this master-slave dialectics bit is that in order to be aware of ourselves, we have to encounter ourselves as another or in another, but the other person that we encounter is one in number. We're one in number. And so there's this problem that when I find the other as myself, I'm one in number, so I can't share my being with them. They can't share their being with me. We inevitably then fall into conflict. We battle over our identities because we can't share them. And it's funny, maybe this is a very quick and fast reconstruction, but I understand like this whole appeal to reason later on in phenomenology as a way of of addressing the problem that arises when all of us are just singular individuals with no universality in common. The universal is supposed to bind us in such a way that when I identify with the universal, right, I'm not put into conflict with you or anyone else. If we all identify with the universal can be multiply instantiated and that not be a problem for any of the instances or something. So somehow I understood like Hegel's solution to this problem of, well, we fall into conflict when we identify with one another, when we're one number, to identifying with the universal. And then by finding our being in the universal, we're no longer having to, as it were, steal our identities from the other. And so it's very interesting, I guess. This is maybe another one of the Hegel arguing that, in fact, being these ineffable singulars actually can be the basis for constant conflict because there's a lack of unity. But I saw that what you did was you united us in our
Right.
non-identity. So you
Yeah.
found a point of unity that can only be expressed as a contradiction, which I really like, of course. But I was wondering how if you have any thoughts about
Right.
those bits and yeah, if that made any
What
sense, what I just articulated.
what your comments now make me think is that um, the solution to our being, atomic singularities at war, one with another, could be finding then, common denominators that all share in, the nation. You build a community on the basis of, I'm thinking in just the opposite direction, I have to say.
Yeah, yeah,
I,
yeah.
that we're in a situation where we have lots of identities
Yes.
in conflict with one another, and that have communities behind them. And I'm saying we have to think non-identity. We have to think back to the, that singular non-identity that we all share in common. I'm not seeing that as a state of war of all against all.
Yeah.
I can see why that it might have looked that way to Thomas Hobbes. Um, I see it from the from the opposite end now of a historical
Yeah.
process.
Yes, yes. Because in your case, it seems that you do have there is something shared in common though, right? There is somehow something binding us all, even if it is our non-identity,
Right.
or at least it's the way that we are inevitably articulating it, right? So,
It's a potential in any case. It
yeah,
means, reach out towards the person in front of you.
yeah, because it's a difference between absolute non-identity and the identity in our non-identity, right? And I somehow think there might be a difference between these two
Right,
versus say like an absolute universal and a
right,
relative universal, or
right,
yeah,
right. Again, I do acknowledge the necessity for identity and identity politics, but I want them always to be related beyond to
yes,
a
yes,
non-identity that really is shared in common. Because, any identity, we can say universal human rights, but the Chinese saying, no, no, that's your,
yeah,
business. Whoever defines it and however they define it, it's never going to be acceptable to all. So it has to be this release of whatever our universal is in order to embrace
yeah,
being, just being with others and then producing something together. But there is the moment where, of identity, forging identities together. I'm not saying non-identity is the solution if we just latch onto non-identity, but it has to work, right, dialectically with our identities in order to enable them to harmonize and to find the common ground between them.
That's a very stimulating thought, something I'll carry with me as I try to write my book on ethics and freedom, which is that there's some kind of non-identity shared in common. There's something about the way that contradiction works, possibly. There's a kind of because the non-identity is not anything shared. So
That's
it's
right. Well,
not
it's a
identical.
something nothing. That's right.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
a something
that's
nothing.
nice. Yeah.
But you do have to sort of aim at something in order to let it be nothing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's nice because it's a kind of contradiction that can be used as the basis of political critique and political
Yeah.
philosophy.
Yeah.
It's nice.
Good.
Alex, you can follow up
Yeah,
now.
yeah. I mean, I wanted to weigh in on these two things you just said, Greg, because I think maybe I have. I mean, we use different vocabularies, and maybe there was actually something I wanted to ask William that maybe connects with all these. So there is a speculative part, and then there is the political part. So I will start with the speculative. I have an impression that. So I was very much interested in what you said about the neutral in contemporary French thought when you uh, I mean, rightly, I agree, connected the problem of university with the problem of neutrality. This idea, Roland Barthes, Deleuze, they all have this idea of the neutral. And I think maybe here there is, I mean, a problem, so to say. And I actually read Hegel in a slightly different way. For instance, I do think that in Hegel there is some sort of unity between university and plurivocity of being, so to say. So the idea is it is impossible to just answer to the question whether being is univocal or analogical or plurivocal, because that's precisely the problem. And there is this beautiful quote by Hegel when he says, "The singular is at the same time the fulfillment and the loss concept." And the problem is to understand this. What does it mean that that the fulfillment and the loss are the same thing, so to say? And I'd say this maybe shows a problem. So this is maybe, so to say, the argument, but it's not really an argument. I'm not critical. Um, I have the impression that uh, when you have radical apophantic, I mean, the so to say, apophatic speech is the only alternative when you have a pure apophantic understanding of language. So if your idea is that the only way you can talk about things is what Aristotle means in the metaphysics. So to say, subject, predicate, uh, so to say, logical determination. If you don't accept that there are other ways of speaking about things, then the only alternative is apophatic theology. The only way is, so to say, a theory of non-language, a theory of non-saying, so to say. And here I come to the political part. Maybe that's the dilemma and the problem with also with woke culture and identity politics, because I feel that I'm also very critical of identity politics, and my problem with identity politics is precisely this problem. So they so to say, they fail where they could, so to say, shine, so that they, in the end, still understand identity in a pure apophantic way, and they still have this purely logical, static, deterministic, classical, categorical understanding of identity. Whereas the theory of performance are precisely the opposite. The theories of performance are precisely the idea that, listen, identity is not that. Identity is not, you don't say that someone is Italian in the same way that you say that something is a tree. These two sentences look the same, but they are not the same sentence. and they are not, they do not have the same logic underneath them. So my problem with your proposal politically is that, of course, I mean, what is the immediate counter argument? Um, I'm sure you're not saying that, but it sounds like what you're saying is something similar to the argument, let's not talk about feminicide, let's just talk about homicide. Let's not talk about, so to say, specific identity-related social problems. Let's talk about the general justice and general well-being and being good with each other. Whereas, of course, the protest immediately is, yeah, but I mean, my problem is not the general problem of human violence. My problem is the problem of masculine violence against women, or I don't know, patriarchal violence against gay people, or in my case, for instance, I mean, I just to give an example you're not familiar with, maybe, but which is a problem for me. I do not accept being said that I'm white. I'm from Naples, and in Italy there is a very specific problem about colonialism and the relationship between northern Italy and southern Italy. I will not be told by anyone that I am a white male in the sense that someone from New York is a white male. So the I feel that maybe that's the issue, and maybe another way around it is precisely to refute this simple alternative between apophantic and apophatic, and say there is another way of speaking about things, and it is what maybe what Greg, so to say, conceptualizes under the idea of hyperrealism. Maybe I have a more hermeneutical understanding of it. So for me, it's much more about when Hegel speaks about the unity of the opposites. I'm not sure what his meaning is, so to say, the problem of contradiction in an Aristotelian way, but rather the idea that, I mean, reality is so complex that it is not enough to just have an apophantic description of it. I know it's a very long and complex
Mhm.
question, argument, proposal, but I hope it was clear what I was meaning.
Mhm. No, it does give really quite a lot to think about. And of course, I'm sensitive to the issue that, erasing identities is going to be very unsatisfactory to those who have agendas and that need to be militating for certain rights, for against feminicide, for example, as you say. Um, and I guess I would, the question I would pose is, all right, it's necessary to identify this as male violence against women. Um, I can see why that's necessary, but um, I wonder whether we have to think even further through these categories that if you set up really a kind of a static opposition, there's the good gender and the bad gender, the victim
Mhm.
and the aggressor. Um, I do feel that we can worsen the problem in some ways, though, I'm sure people say, no, this is the only way in which progress has been made. Um, but of course, everyone's reading of the history of any of these things is totally political itself. And the point that I just want to bring to the table, I don't want to oppose somebody that has an agenda, against, you name the example of feminicide, but I want to see it in a larger context. And there are reasons why women are vulnerable in certain ways specific to being women, and of course, there I tread on dangerous ground as well. You don't want to be called a white man. There are plenty that don't want to be called maybe women. I don't know, but uh, we have to be sensitive, obviously, um, to the the maybe the aggressive nature to the violent nature of our language, and of our categories, categorical thinking. Um, it's it's always at risk of being violent to some. What I would try to bring in a constructive vein to the conversation is the awareness that even that these men who maybe are the guilty parties, they are humans as well. That and even I don't want human to become a closed concept either. They're all the animals. Think of the violence that is done to animals systematically. It's a Holocaust every day. Um, and if we fixate on certain categories, then and there's a kind of a war, and maybe the reasons why certain wars have to be fought. But let's put it in a context beyond those conflicts and acknowledge that you know that the perpetrators and the victims, um, they do share something in common. That's a necessary basis, I think, for any possibility of forgiveness, of
Mhm.
reconciliation. And, some will reject those possibilities. Okay, maybe I have to respect their moment of, not being capable, but we're going to all destroy ourselves if we're not able at some point to recover the capacity for forgiveness, understanding. There's nobody that's not been insulted and hurt and harmed in myriad ways.
If I can clarify, because I'm very sympathetic with what you're saying, and I mean, I'd be even more radical on this. I mean, in a way, I mean, the big discussion that is very hard to face is that perpetrators are often victims in a different
Sure.
way.
Why are those males
Uh,
violent? What's
yeah, yeah, of course,
in their culture
absolutely.
upbringing?
And also, well, I mean, in the examples you're bringing up, that's precisely what I wanted to address. I mean, mine was a critic against. I mean, I was sharing. I also have a critical stance on the general way woke culture as expresses itself many times, because behind the idea that of males as perpetrators and females as victims, etc., there is precisely the problem of essentialism. So I really wanted to ground this in, so to say, in the logical problem, and maybe I'll try to rephrase that. Um, my problem is not. So I wanted to try and propose maybe an alternative. So instead of, so to say, refusing the categories and say we all share the fact that we are ineffably singulars, so to say, which is, if I understand correctly, your proposals, which I understand uh, is the apophatic way. And the way I understand it, we must do this because the alternative is essentialism. So the alternative is apophantic language. And apophantic language is saying that something is that or that, which is insufficient. My alternative is uh, apophantic language is not the only alternative. There is also another way of speaking about things. And what we need is an education around the fact that when I say that someone is a woman, for instance, or when I say that someone is Italian, or that someone is a male, or stuff like that, I'm saying something that logically does not work in the same way as where I'm saying that, I don't know, the pen is on the table, or I don't know, that thing out there is a tree. So maybe, I mean, we need a more elastic use of language rather than a radical alternative between, so to say, this apophatic alternative and maybe how I read Hegel, so to say. That's why I wanted to ground this in the univocal analogical the distinction. But I wanted to make clear I absolutely agree with your critical stance against the debate. So I find it really detestable that this is all conceptualized in some radical, so to say, debates as a struggle between males and females, or as a radical axiological um, separation between victims and perpetrators. This is a very bad way of doing this. And I think that's the problem of woke culture, that in a way, the biggest idea and the great idea of people like Butler or Monique Wittig or the big intellectuals behind this movement is you must not be essentialist. And in the end, woke culture is a new form of essentialism.
Mm.
That's what I wanted to strike. I don't know
Yeah.
whether you agree, but I'm sympathetic
Oh,
with
yeah.
you.
Well, no, that paradox is really a central axis of, my book now. Um, that, I want to valorize the principles on which wokeism is based. It's, ethically, it's absolutely right, but put into action, it is often produced exactly the opposite, really, a counter oppression. That's really the paradox that we're dealing with. And um, I want to there's the speculative component of your question as well. Um, again, univocity and equivocity, or and analogic. Um, these categories really need each other. We think of them, all of our thinking in language is oppositional. Univocal has a meaning over against analogical. So I don't think we can absolutize and dichotomize into, apophatic, apophantic. Absolutely. We're always thinking in the space between. And, I guess our contributions, my contribution to this discussion is it's has to, play into a certain context. I feel a need to repropose a certain paradigm. I'm calling it, apophatic thinking. But I'm not, if I say this is all we need, here's the truth, just get this. Um, no, then that's exactly that's what happens with, we were just talking a minute ago, with the woke ideology. That is, the the brilliant insight into the fundamental equality, and this is the Hegelian moment of the Enlightenment, really, and wokeism goes back to that. It is inspired by the Enlightenment ideals. Um, and this is a constant pattern. Religious revelation produces religions and eventually oppression, right? And suffocating the truth. This is the dialectic of history. Every revelation of shining truth that does inspire us, and we see this truth. Um, but as it's incorporated, historically played out, it turns into its opposite. And that's why we need the dialectic, the contradiction, to keep trying to come back to that original vision. The archaic was evoked by one of our participants in this discussion earlier on. Um,
Yeah,
Wonderful. Yeah, this has just been a nice exchange and talking about the ineffability of singularity and opposing it to the epophantic. And then we were thinking about alternative ways of speaking of the singular without necessarily being silent, whether that's a logic of contradiction or this more elastic language that Alex was speaking of, or maybe the poetic, also the poetics of language that William was speaking of in connection to the apophatic. So all these, ideas, are really, important options for thinking about the singular. And thanks so much, William, for your presentation, because I think it really brought out these these different ways of thinking about it that wouldn't have come to the fore, as it were, would not have been shown without your saying what you said. So
Well, no, and thanks for, wonderful for your questions and comments and all. Um, one final comment. The heart of my talk as I, you know, understood it myself was really Duns Scotus. Uh,
Mhm.
and as the real, the thinker of singularity. And I'm still struggling with that myself. One of the books that was held up early on, Dante's Paradiso and the Theological Origins of Modern Thought, part two is really focused on Duns Scotus. And as I mentioned, I've been reading Lazzella, um, on Duns Scotus and the thinker of singularity. When I wrote, that book, I was conceding that Duns Scotus is not a negative theologian. He's really the opposite. But and I even said, actually, maybe being the opposite is a way of being a negative theologian. I'm seeing, more and more. It will be very interesting when, let's say it's next month, I think, or it's certainly
In
coming
June,
up.
maybe. Mhm.
Okay, yeah. I'm very curious as to, what he does. I assume it will be about Duns Scotus because, my own scholarly focus is, of course, Dante, but I found that putting him into relation here with Duns Scotus gave me a different kind of leverage over, the whole of our intellectual tradition. With the scientific culture, that he is really at the root of that, even though he is so much a theologian. Um, and we've forgotten the theological part by and large. So anyway, um,
Oh, but
I you
thank you,
know
because that was the most exciting. I mean, one of the most exciting parts of your paper. I was very much interested in this coupling between Dante and Duns Scotus. So it was also, I mean, last year we had a paper on Duns Scotus. I think this will be an ongoing discussion. And of course, it is a pivotal author. So it's a very exciting way of bringing him up as well. So I will now have to read not only the book on Don Quixote, but also the one on Dante's Purgatorio.
yeah, it's
well, I'm
really
hoping that Andrew Lazzella will give us some kind of a synthesis of his work on Duns Scotus.
I really hope you will. Yes.
Okay.
Thank you so much, William. This
Yeah.
was really brilliant. It was a great contribution, and I'm so grateful, really.
Yeah. Thank you, both of you and all of you.
Yeah, thanks so much. And
We'll see each other
so
again.
we'll see you again soon. And
Right.
uh, this will be on YouTube for until the apocalypse. So
Yeah,
so
I sometimes
Yes.
wonder about that. Good.
yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
wonderful.
If
Yeah.
that's okay with
I'll
you,
I'll,
we're
I'll
just
link
gonna
it.
leave it up for
I'll
the
link.
yeah. If that's okay with you, we'll just leave it up for posterity.
Absolutely. I'll link it to my site as well, to
Perfect.
my Vanderbilt page. I've